Okay, welcome to Iranian Cultural Association. Today is Monday, 14th of February, and our distinguished speaker is Dr. Morad Eghbal. He's going to talk about some perspectives on water and security in the Near East, with a special emphasis on Iran and earth-generated water. Briefly, I'm going to introduce him. Welcome one and all to our کانون دوستداران فرهنگ ایران weekly meeting this evening. The selected topic and theme for this evening centers on water and security generally, and more specifically focuses on water in Iran. It is a very broad topic, but our invited speaker is likely to present a different perspective. Water has always played an important and vital role in Iran from the very beginning of nation's history, several millennia ago to this very day. The importance is emphasized also by the country's historic, geographic, and geopolitical location at so many different crossroads, north and south, east and west. Too many to want to mention here and now. In more recent times, water and the lack, shortage, or absence of this vital resource in Iran have become even more exacerbated due to climate change. Potential approaches to find a workable and lasting solution for these dire circumstances range from more traditional conservation effort to price hikes to other potential approaches like desalination and water diversion schemes from river water if and when it can be allocated. All along, the nation has also been plagued by historic floods and long-lasting damage from such events. These circumstances have brought about considerable instability and discontent in the country's growing population, which now nears some 84 million plus in a politically volatile region of the world, east, west, north, and south, and have caused further uncertainty for the nation's already tenuous economy. This evening, we welcome Professor Morad Eghbal, whom we invited to present a somewhat different and not much publicized aspect of water and security in the context of earth-generated water. Professor Eghbal, professional and multidisciplinary activities span two different professions: geology, geophysics, and international and comparative law. In regard to his scientific training, he received his university education at George Washington University and was awarded undergraduate and graduate degree there. Academically, his further education later continued at Howard University to result in a Juris Doctor degree, and later at McGeorge School of the Law, where he earned an advanced graduate law degree and LL.M in Transnational business practice. Furthermore, he brings some 40 plus years of consulting experience in water resources, natural resources management, and environmental and climate change issues to the task this evening. During a 2 decades long teaching career, which included a well-regarded trial advocacy class at Harvard University School of Law, he served on the full-time faculty at the University of Baltimore School of the Law, where he taught legal, ethical, and historical studies in the graduate school, international management and organizational behavior in the business school, and international and comparative law in the law school, and served for more than a decade as deputy director at the Center for International and Comparative Law, and for 6 years as the inaugural director of the school graduate law program in the law of the United States, to put his multidisciplinary experience in some context for you. Before his work in the vineyard of the academia, Professor Eghbal also served as a judicial clerk to the late Honorable William Benson Bryant Jr., Senior United District Judge and former Chief Judge of the United States District Court for the District of Columbia. For some time as a foreign associate at the premier Swiss law firm of Pestalozzi and Patry in Zurich, Switzerland, and in the law offices of former Senator Omer L. Raines, the former chair of the Judiciary Committee of the California State Senate. Professor Eghbal, the floor is yours. You have between 50 to 60 minutes for your presentation. Then we have questions and comments.
دکتر مقیمی محترم و گرامی، از خوش آمد و لطف شما ممنون و سپاسگزارم در معرفی. حضار محترم، از شرکت شما در این جلسه و توجه شما به این مطلب سپاسگزارم. قبل از شروع این ارائه مایلم قدردانی خود را به کانون ابراز دهم برای این فرصتی که برای صحبت شده است. این بحث در مورد موضوعی است که برای کار حرفه‌ایم و دهه‌ها متمرکز است و با این دعوت شما لطف دارید که در این مورد بیانی کنم. و همچنین می‌خواهم در اینجا پدر و مادر مرحومم را یاد داشته باشم که تصمیمات اولیه آنان در مورد زندگی من به شدت تحت تأثیر پیشرفتم قرار گرفت و پایه پایداری را برایم گذاشت تا این کار را انجام دهم. در نهایت می‌خواهم این ارائه را به خاطره‌ای از کریستوفر برد و استفان ریس اختصاص دهم که در مورد آنها بیشتر به اطلاعاتان خواهم رساند. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Dr. Morimi, for your warm welcome. Before beginning this presentation, I wish to express my appreciation to the Kanoon for this opportunity to discuss a topic that has been central to my professional work and for decades. I also wish to remember here my late parents, whose early decisions regarding my life so deeply influenced my development and laid an enduring foundation for me to undertake this work. Lastly, I would like to dedicate this presentation to the memory of Christopher Bird and Stefan Ries, about whom you will hear more in the course of my remarks. Just to give you a quick outline of where we might be going in the next 40 to 45 minutes, I will try to give you a summary outline of what Earth-generated water is all about. And I will then focus on Iran at the end, and what these implications might have for Iran. And we will finish with a very short video about qanats. And I'm asking of all of you participating here, please to consider what I am presenting to you and apply it to that very short video. And then you can draw your own conclusions and maybe you have your own questions. Let me see if I can work my technology. to share the screen. There we are. I hope everybody can see this.
Yes, go ahead.
Water is a topic of discussion in many venues, on many platforms, and in many contexts. It might be helpful for us to have a very high altitude view of this topic in order to better to understand its vital importance, not only for the world at large, but particularly for Iran. There are 510 million square kilometers of area on the surface of the Earth, but less than 30% of this is covered by land. The rest is water in the form of vast oceans. This visualization uses data primarily from the United Nations Statistics Division to rank the world's countries by their share of Earth's surface. The largest countries by surface are Russia with 3.35%, Canada with 1.96%, and China with 1.88%. Together, they occupy roughly 7.2% of the Earth's surface. Russia is so big that even if we divided the country between Asian and European sections, those new regions would still be the largest in their respective continents. Antarctica, although not a country, covers the second largest amount of land overall at 2.75%. Meanwhile, the other nations that surpass the 1% mark for surface area include the United States, 1.87%, Brazil, 1.67%, and Australia, 1.51%. The remaining 195 countries, regions below 1% combined account for the other half of the Earth's land surface. Among the world's smallest countries are the island nations of the Caribbean and the South Pacific. However, the tiniest of the tiny are Vatican City and Monaco, which combine for a total area of just 2.51 square kilometers. The remaining 70% of Earth's surface is water, 27% territorial waters, 43% international waters or areas beyond national jurisdiction, and of those, only 0.5% of fresh water is available to human beings for use. So it gives you an idea just how precious this resource is. And as an aside, I should share with you that you see the Olympics in Beijing, the Winter Olympics, the total amount of fresh water being used to make snow is enough to supply 900 million people for a week in their freshwater supply. In the past, nations adhered to the freedom of the seas doctrine, a 17th century principle that limited jurisdiction over the oceans to a narrow area along a nation's coastline. The rest of the seas did not belong to any nation and were free for countries to travel and exploit. This situation lasted into the 20th century, but by mid-century, there was an effort to extend national claims as competition for offshore resources became increasingly fierce and ocean pollution became an issue. In 1982, the United Nations adopted the Law of the Sea Convention, which extended international law over the extraterritorial waters. The convention established freedom of navigation rights and set territorial sea boundaries 12 miles, i.e. 19 kilometers offshore, with exclusive economic zones up to 200 miles or 322 kilometers offshore, extending the country's influence over maritime resources. The size of countries is the outcome of politics, economics, history, and geography. But put simply, borders can change over time, and they do. In 1946, there were 76 independent countries in the world, and today there are 195. There are forces that push together or pull apart landscapes over time. While physical geography plays a role in the identity of nations, Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan, the former ruler of the United Arab Emirates, a tiny Gulf nation, put it best, and I quote, "A country is not measured by the size of its area on the map, a country is truly measured by its heritage and culture, end of quote. And in that regard, Iran and Iranian history ranks in the top of any ranking. Addressing the question of a comprehensive national water resources plan for Iran intricately ties the topic to the related question of developing alternative energy resources, supplies, and markets. It seems germane to consider the question as a component of such discussions and part of the problem of a looming water shortage that for the past half century at least seems to grow from decade to decade and has been the focus of more and more dire predictions in the national and world press. The shortage results primarily from two causes, as we are told. The first of these is the overpumping of groundwater from fairly shallow aquifers, such as is the case, for example, with the Ogallala in the United States that underlies the high plains states from the Dakotas to the Texas Panhandle. Replenishment of the water extracted by precipitation has not kept time with an over-greedy mining of this aqueous resource. Should the tapping of such aquifers continue at present rates, the question arises as to whether that portion of the high plains overlying the Ogallala aquifer will not once again become the Great American Desert, as it was labeled on maps in the middle of the 19th century, long before the water below it was used for irrigation. This progressive process of desertification applies mutatis mutandis also to other parts of the world, especially to Iran, as the clip at the end of the presentation will show you. The second is the increasing pollution of groundwater sources in many areas due to influx of chemicals and other toxins. Typical is the 9 million gallons of chemicals that poured into Price's Pit, the municipal dump at Atlantic City, New Jersey in 1982, which caused water in 10 of 14 city wells to become non-potable. The solutions to this problem advanced by policymakers, as for example in decades-long debates held by the California legislature, are basically only two in number. One of them is emplacing highly expensive long-distance plumbing in the form of pipelines, canals, and other conduits to channel water from rivers or from impoundments behind dams. This approach has been favored since the days of the Babylonian king Hammurabi, who built an extensive system of irrigation canals in his Near Eastern domain, and of the vast network of aqueducts constructed throughout their empire by the Romans, or the extensive system of qanats, which developed in ancient Persian civilizations and were still maintained until about a half century ago, just to name a few examples. The second solution involves a plea to arrest the construction of near astronomically expensive and in arid regions environmentally especially questionable water impoundment and transportation schemes, and concentrate instead on the conservation of existing supplies through the voluntary limitation of use or rationing, or perhaps more effectively, through a steep rise in the cost of water to users. Neither the conservationists nor the long-distance plumbing advocates seem to be aware of a third alternative solution to water shortage problems that, with the exception of a few proponents who have alluded to its potential for more than a century, has lain dormant because of a clinging to outworn dogma on the part of the hydrogeological fraternity, whose authority, in quotation marks, seems to rule supreme on matters of water development. This dogma insists that all water available to humankind on this planet derives exclusively from the hydrologic cycle, the process whereby water evaporates from surface bodies such as oceans and lakes, or transpires through vegetation into the atmosphere, thence to fall as rain, snow, or other precipitation onto the ground, into which it either percolates to form subterranean aquifers, or from which it runs off into streams, rivers, and other natural water courses. Advocates of a third alternative solution to the above-mentioned problem have taken water's use and resource development as an exception to the well-entrenched indispensable notion that the Earth's water can only be meteoric in nature. They have affirmed that the Earth itself generates massive amounts of water from deep inside it that has no connection to the water of the hydrologic cycle, though once it surfaces, it may become mixed into and part of said hydrologic cycle. You see here a slide that shows, it's a schematic that shows the hydrologic cycle. You see here the precipitation, it comes down, it enters into the ground. This is evaporation. Transpiration is when it evaporates from trees. And think about how we're losing trees at a rapid rate, and then it goes through the cycle. This is what the hydrologic cycle looks like. They maintain that if this water can be tapped by drilling, it will constitute a copious, indeed inexhaustible supply of pure, unpolluted water for a thirsty world. Leonardo da Vinci, in his famous treatise on water, championed the idea that water came both from precipitation and from internally generated sources. In his history of his hydrology, Acid Bisphas notes that the Renaissance genius, and I quote, characteristically reported an occasional doubt about certain aspects of both theories, but nothing has been found which would indicate that he at any time had discarded the basic concepts of either of them. In fact, the chances seem good that he believed both systems to operate concurrently. This is Earth-generated water. You see that the schematic here shows water rising through these fissures to the surface, and the W shows wells, and I'll get to that in a minute. This is Leonardo da Vinci's folio of his treatise on water. In 1896, Adolf Erik Nordenskiöld, a Stockholm professor of mineralogy and Arctic explorer, brought out an essay about drilling for water in primary rocks. That was the title, which was to win him a nomination for the first Nobel Prize in physics, though he died before the prize was actually awarded. Nordenskiöld had spent years on rocky promontories off the Swedish coast and islands that lay off it, organizing the drilling of wells for pilotage stations, forced to import water or capture rain. The impetus for his effort came from his father, Niels, chief of mining in Finland, who had told him with some awe that while salt water never penetrated iron mines on the Finnish coast, even when they were well below sea level, fresh water was always present on the rocky floors of the same mines. From his work, Nordenskiöld concluded that a new type of water, independent of the hydrologic cycle and generated by the Earth itself, was available. He called this water primary, due to its association with so-called primary rocks, which geologists term magmatic, or those such as felsic granite, tumafic gabbro, and intermediate diorite, basalt, and rhyolite, which all derive from the molten magma deep within the Earth, and later cool to crystallize into igneous rocks. He also affirmed that one could sink wells capable of producing such primary water, as he had coined the term, year-round along the northern and southern coast of the Mediterranean Sea and in the whole of Asia Minor, or precisely in at least one part of the world afflicted with aridity. Shortly after the appearance of Nordenskiöld's essay, his speculations about water newly formed in the Earth were echoed by the German geologist Edward Suess, who coined the term juvenile or youthful to characterize it. Speaking with a special reference to the thermal springs at Karlsbad, now Karlovy Vary in the former Czechoslovakia, he advanced strong arguments to show that waters of this class see the light of day for the first time. That is, they issue from deep within the Earth, from the fundamental magma itself, to bring up veritable additions to the hydrosphere. Suess Zeus's contribution was noted by Frank Wigglesworth Clark, a geologist with the United States Geological Survey, who, in a long memoir published in 1924, almost 100 years ago, wrote that one of the most important questions for geology to answer was whether it is possible to discriminate between waters of superficial or vadose origin and magmatic or deep-seated waters. Clark cites the work of Armand Gauthier, who pointed out several criteria for discriminating between vadose and magmatic waters, and who stated that 1 cubic kilometer of granite subjected to the requisite heat and pressure within the earth could yield from 25 to 30 million metric tons of, or something in excess of 8 billion gallons of water, which at 1100 degrees centigrade would form 160 billion cubic meters of steam. Without addressing here the rest of Gauthier's findings, may we simply stress that in the matter of the potential existence of primary, juvenile, magmatic, or original water, Clark believes the Frenchman's broad general conclusions, and I quote, are entitled to the most respectful consideration, end of quote. In a paper published in 2000, I suggested the use of the term earth-generated water because it seemed more descriptive and precise than all the other adjectives previously used in the literature to describe this kind of water. The eminent mining geologist Josiah Edward Spur, in his 2-volume treatise published in 1923, called attention to the fact that the existence of water as an essential component of igneous magmas had long been recognized. The existence was clearly shown by the vast clouds of water vapors which rise from cooling water when volcanic eruptions take place. Spur adds that an association between the formation of mineral veins and water dates back to at least 1847, when Elie de Beaumont wrote a masterful treatise drawing together as closely connected the mineral deposits from volcanic fumaroles and those from spring water. The fundamental idea that there is a thermodynamic cycle within the earth that both produces and is fueled by water was still of concern, at least up to 1942, when Oskar Mainzer, formerly head of the groundwater division of the US Geological Survey, in his book Hydrology, published in 1942, put forward his belief that waters of internal origin are tangible additions to the Earth's water supply. Yet, it was not, said Mainzer, to hydrology that the study of such waters properly belonged, but to those branches of geology connected to the study of ore deposits and the action of volcanoes. Such a pronouncement may go far to explain why hydrologists have been content virtually to ignore a resource of potentially great importance over the 80 years that have elapsed since Mainzer's book appeared. 15 years ago, before the publication of his book, Mainzer in a long essay referred to huge springs in the United States that yield 5,000 gallons of water per minute and more. Those of the first magnitude produced more than 50,000 gallons per minute, round the clock, and were to be found in volcanic rock, limestone, or sandstone. One incredibly productive water source flowing out of limestone is the Ain Figuet spring that alone supplied water for over 1 million residents in Damascus in Syria, and is also the principal source of the Baroda River. A report on the spring by the World Bank reads, and I quote, "The principal emergence for the spring, which has been enclosed in a structure since Roman times, resembles an underground river several meters across, which flows up and out of the limestone formation of the mountain. The total flow has averaged about 132,000 gallons per minute. The quality is very good. Its temperature and pH are relatively constant, 14 degrees centigrade and 7.9 respectively. Its taste and color are excellent, and bacterial contamination at the source is practically non-existent," end of quote. The same report is equivocal about the origin of the massive amount of water which has been flowing from this spring for millennia. In addition to sources of natural occurrence flowing out of rock, such as those just cited, and to which many other examples throughout the world could be added, the presence of such water has been evidenced through accident. During the mining of the famous Comstock silver lode at Virginia City, Nevada, a shaft sunk to a level of 3,250 feet into the ore-bearing rock unleashed a flood of water so large that the pumps lifting 5.2 million gallons of it every 24 hours could not stem the tide. By October of 1886, after the pumps were finally shut down, the water rose to the 2,400-foot level, filling the entire lower workings of half a dozen mines, including several miles of crosscuts. No less impressive was the watering out of the huge Tombstone silver mine in Arizona. To quote one account, at the 800-foot level, the pumps were raising 2.3 million gallons of water daily. In 1909, it was given out that boiler breakdown had shut down the drainage system and that before repairs could be effected, the entire complex had been drowned beyond redemption, end of quote. To get an idea of how much water was flowing in these cases, it can be said that the amount issuing from the Tombstone would take care of a city of 10,000 persons, and that funneling into the Comstock, some 25,000. The existence of water in such mines as those at Tombstone and Virginia City is not exceptional, as indicated by Josiah Edward Spur's conclusion arrived at after years of studying ore deposits in mines all over North America. Spur wrote, and I quote, "In short, the result of my own experience is this. I have traversed and studied exhaustively and mapped carefully many thousands of mine workings at all depths, frequently thousands of feet below the surface. At all depths, I have noticed openings in rocks, especially along fault or fracture zones, and found water circulating vigorously along them. These waters were cold, lukewarm, or rarely hot," end of quote. Engineers digging tunnels have also frequently been faced with an outrush of water from what had to be considered an anomalous, if not mysterious source, given the depth at which it was contacted. Typical was the Tecolote Tunnel, which runs 6.4 miles through the Santa Ynez Mountains to transport water from the Cachuma Reservoir to Santa Barbara, California. In the drilling process, the work was impeded by subterranean flows of 9,000 gallons of water per minute, some of which was cool and fresh, some hot and mineralized. But the city of Santa Barbara could have by now saved in water supply expenses by drilling to tap such water at a cost orders of magnitude less expensive than the 1957 completion price of the tunnel of $40 million, is a matter of conjecture central to the thesis of this presentation. Another anomalous episode, one of the strangest to occur in the annals of construction engineering, took place in Manhattan, where in 1955, the engineering firm of Psati and Furman began the excavation for the addition to the Harlem Hospital at the intersection of 5th Avenue and 136th Street. While removing a layer of rock only 12 feet below ground on St. Valentine's Day, workers were suddenly confronted with an enormous outgulfing of water, which began rapidly to fill the vast excavation. Pumps hurried to the site, labored day and night at the rate of 2,000 gallons per minute to keep the working area free of water. Particularly puzzling to engineers was the fact that during the cold winter months, the water maintained a constant temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit and was so pure that hospital chemists who analyzed it certified it could be drunk without chlorination or other chemical treatment. 1.25 billion gallons were pumped out of the hole until 12 stories of structural steel had been erected and several floors decked with concrete slabs to provide enough weight to hold down the foundation of the new building against hydrostatic pressure. In June of that year, the engineering news record ran a story that ended with the baffling note that neither the origin nor the constant elevated temperature of the water could be explained. Of the article's readers, Dr. Michael Saltzman, then a professor at the University of California School of Commerce, who had served as an engineer with the US Navy's Hydrographic Office, took up the challenge implied by the news records article. As author of a recently published book, New Water for a Thirsty World, which championed the idea that primary water represented an alternative for developing water resources worldwide, he wrote a brief note setting forth his argument as to why the water in the excavation hole was most likely primary in nature. When the note was published, it carried the journal editor's commentary, which in part stated, and I quote, "It is surprising that despite efforts in many agencies, the source of the flow has apparently never been determined, and more surprising, that there has been no other comment to this journal on possible reasons for the flow and its origin," end of quote. Despite the fact that New York City has been faced with serious water shortages over the intervening decades, no effort has been made to utilize the more than 3 million gallons a day that came out of the granite of Gotham's body near the Harlem Hospital, or to drill for more such sources. Trying to explain this over half a century ago, Saltzman pointedly wrote, and I quote, "There can be but one reason why this water, despite its purity and constant flow, is not used, and that lies in the many fears associated with it, since its existence cannot be explained by conventional hydrologic practice," end of quote. The dedication to Saltzman's book reads to Stefan Ries for his demonstrating his firm belief in democracy, individual initiative, free enterprise, and the need for open minds to the end that all men and women may be truly free to think and solve the great problems of their times, end of quote. The subject of his dedication is a Bavarian-born mining engineer and geologist who emigrated to the United States in 1923. While working in a deep mine at high elevation in the 1930s, Ries was amazed after a load of dynamite set forth in the bottom of it to see water come gushing out of nowhere in such quantities that pumps installed to remove it at the rate of 25,000 gallons per minute could not make a dent in it. Staring down into the valley below, Ries asked himself how water that supposedly had trickled into the earth as rain could rise through the hard rock into the shafts and tunnels of a mine nearly at the top of a mountain range. The temperature and purity of the water suggested to Ries it must have a completely different origin from ordinary groundwater, since none of the textbooks he had studied had referred to what seemed to confront him as an entirely anomalous phenomenon. He decided to look into it. In 1957, after Ries had been working on the problem nearly 2 decades, the Encyclopedia Britannica Book of the Year ran the following statement, and I quote, "Stefan Ries of California formulated a theory that new water, which never existed before, is constantly being formed within the earth by the combination of elemental hydrogen and oxygen, and that this water within the earth finds its way to the surface and can be located and tapped to constitute a steady and unfailing new supply," end of quote. Here is not the place to document the incredible success Ries has had over 40 years of practice drilling water wells at sites where professional hydrologists and geologists flatly predicted that not a drop of water could be found. We will limit ourselves to citing a passage from an unpublished statement made by Ries in 1954, and I quote, "My discovery was put to the field test by locating and drilling many water wells. The record to date from these tests is 70 producing wells out of 72 attempts, all drilled in hard rock, all located in distressed areas generally considered unproductive," end of quote. That was nearly 3/4 of a century ago. Since then, and until he died in 1986, the number of wells brought in by Stefan Ries had risen to many hundred. Christopher Bird and I came across the findings of Stefan Ries while waiting one day in 1976 in the outer office of the Director of Hydrology of the US Geological Survey in Western Virginia. Looking through the bookshelves, we came across Saltzman's book. When we were accorded our interview with the chief hydrologist, as well as a number of his staffers, Chris Bird asked about the book which I was holding in my hand and had taken off the shelf in the anteroom. The reaction was one of ridicule and scoffing. Ries was, not unheatedly, all but accused of being a charlatan whose theories and practice were unworthy of the slightest consideration. Had the group in the hydrologic office merely laughed Ries away as a crank, it might never have stimulated Christopher Bird to make contact with him at Ries's home in Ojai, California. But the comments about him were so vituperative a tone that we immediately felt there was much more at stake than the issue of whether his methods were either practically efficient or scientifically sound. It turned out that this suspicion was well-founded. For some 3 years following our visit to Reston, during which Christopher Bird and I traveled with Stefan Ries to look at some of the remarkable examples of his water finding capabilities, we learned that Ries relied partly on petrography and geochemistry and a careful study of geologic fault structures empirically to determine the best places to drill for rock-associated water. It was my privilege to have worked with Stefan Ries for nearly a decade before he passed away. We also learned that this successful practice had become a sore irritant to the Office of California's Director of Water Resources, which at one point had referred to him in print as a, quote, purported scientist, geologist, geochemist, and philosopher, end of quote. Anathematized him and his arguments as specious and utterly speculative, and implied by sending the document containing these statements to the California Attorney General's office, as well as to the California Bureau of Criminal Identification, that Ries was at best as a maverick and a crackpot, at worst a criminal meriting prosecution. What were the underlying reasons for this diatribe? Some of them Chris Bird spelled out in his book, The Divining Hand, in a chapter titled The Politics of Water. For water and its development is a highly political subject, as it turns out, just as are other areas in the development of alternative energies. At the behest of David Ben-Gurion, Ries was invited to the then young state of Israel to help develop her water resources, especially for the city of Eilat at the Gulf of Aqaba, where Ries located and then supervised the successful drilling of a handful of water wells for the city and collaborated closely with Ari Issar in this endeavor. The apparent unwillingness of a profession such as that of hydrology to cotton onto a new idea has many roots. One of them is the apparent, usual, maybe even normal inability of career-oriented specialists to see beyond or reach beyond some of the deeply ingrained dogmas to which their academic training exposed them. Saltzman makes the point that despite the fact that hydrologists profess among themselves at least their non-interest in and scant knowledge of waters of internal origin, they delude both themselves and, more tragically, the public at large by minimizing the amount of these waters that might be inexpensively available, by not mentioning them at all, or by assaulting the very idea of their existence. Thus, in his massive 1121-page tome, The Role of Groundwater in the National Water Situation, C.L. McGuinness, in a section devoted to primary water, states that such water is invariably high in mineral content, and so far as scientists have been able to determine, it is emitted in quantities that are insignificant in comparison to those involved in the hydrologic cycle. The question that arises is, how far have scientists actually gone to determine the nature and amount of deep-seated Earth-generated water? Saltzman stated that if those in the field of hydrology wish to delimit their science to the exclusion of water of internal origin, it is unfortunately the public and their elected representatives who must suffer. It is indeed remarkable and incongruous, he writes, that those to whom the world looks for the solution of water shortages can be so disinterested as to relegate the study of internal waters to other branches of geology, end of quote. In his foreword to Saltzman's book, Aldous Huxley, the English philosopher and writer, asking a poignant question, comments, "It remains to be seen whether those who are now regarded as experts in the field of hydrology and the politicians whom they advise will also agree that a good case has been made and that large-scale experimentation is in order," end of quote. Since Huxley penned that sentence more than 3/4 of a century ago, there has been hardly any such experimentation, large or small, funded by hydrologic officials, state or federal. Stefan Ries proposed serious study of water flowing in rock fissures, and as far back as 1958 underscored this recommendation with a pithy question: why should huge sums be spent to build pipelines over great distances when Mother Nature has created her own pipelines? He answered caustically enough, surely it is far more economical to pump water vertically up 400 to 4,500 feet than to pump and transport it laterally for 450 miles. This opinion was seconded in a public address by Wayne Thompson, co-owner of the largest water well drilling company in Northern California, who stated flatly that within the next decades, he expected water wells would be tapping large amounts of water at 2,000, 4,000, 6,000, and up to 10,000 feet below ground. If Thompson is right, it may be that sheer need to find new water supplies for communities faced with mounting shortages or presently polluted sources the world over will, by demonstrating that sources of deep-seated water hitherto denied to exist by hydrologists, at least force the realization of its existence upon them. And Mother Earth may be found to be producing other important resources as well. The late Thomas Gold, an Austrian-born astronomer at Cornell University, advanced the theory, also considered heretical in geological circles, that our planet constantly provides methane or natural gas at great depth below the surface of the ground. To date, geological dogma holds that all methane derives from organic origins, dead whales, so to say, but Gold suggested that Earth-generated methane of non-biological origin, i.e. abiogenic in its origin, would be a major energy resource. His summary of a paper on the subject concludes that one can expect to find very large quantities of gas in the sparsely explored but accessible region of 15 to 30,000 feet of depth. This is probably as difficult for petroleum geologists to stomach as is the concept of primary or earth-generated water is for hydrologists. A few of the latter are aware that the profession as a whole lags behind the time. In 1960, one of the critics, William C. Ackerman, Vice President of American Geophysical Union and Chief of the Illinois Water Survey Division, tried to shake up his colleagues at a regional meeting at Moscow, Idaho. Ackerman expressed his disappointment that for years, papers on hydrology submitted to the AGO's transactions had been so recondite that most of them had been refused publication. The heart of the problem, concluded Ackerman, was that hydrology had been riding for too long on the backs of its greatest exponents, whose work had been performed prior to World War II, and that nothing of consequence had since been contributed to the subject. Putting these observations and the detail in the context of Iran's water needs and water resources, we need to focus on three particular overarching aspects: the water needs of business, commerce, manufacturing, agriculture, and construction, generally referred to summarily as the private sector; the water needs of the population for its day-to-day use; and the water needs of government to support governmental functions and emergency supplies. It seems reasonable then to begin a draft national water resources plan in a handful of steps. 1, Undertake a full, complete, thorough, accurate, and verifiable inventory of all sources of fresh water in the country, including but not limited to accounting for qanats, whether or not they are now functional or were once operational, and including the identification of suitable development prospects for earth-generated water. 2, undertake a specific nationwide geological and hydrological survey to determine which regions and areas are suitable for potential development of earth-generated water. 3, determine a demographic and regional nationwide profile for the need and use of water at all 3 levels previously alluded to in this presentation. 4, take all raw source data from point 1 through 3 herein and plot them on a lattice overlay of squares for the entire country, each square encoded by a dynamic algorithm such that any change in any one square's algorithm will reflect a commensurate change in all other algorithms to show real-time water usage and water supply. In essence, the nation as a whole will have a broadly based variable algorithm which will monitor water usage, wastewater production, and freshwater supply for the entire nation on a real-time basis. Developing the necessary supporting algorithms would then yield a differentiated network of squares of different sizes and aid in a nationwide management of this vital resource, i.e., the higher the demand, the smaller the graphic representation of size of a square. Based on such distribution scheme, a nationwide network for water delivery could be developed, which would then allow predictable and timely water delivery to all parts of the nation, based on developing at least 2 sources of water for each square to meet the needs of all 3 sectors. Not unlike an electrical grid, the supply of fresh water, seasonally adjusted, could be directed to where the need would be the highest and without depriving the rest of the nation of this vital resource. 5, review and compile all existing laws which relate in any way to the environment, to water, and also the disposal of wastewater to provide a flexible, advanced, and current legal regime which is responsive to the need of the population at all 3 levels mentioned before, and also encourages water conservation practices and measures. The final question before we look at the short clip I have, thanks to my family's backup and support, my daughter's help. A final question for this audience to consider might be, is the economy to which Rees referred so long ago actually wanted? And if so, by whom? By the Iranian public? Almost certainly yes, if it were made aware of the potential. But what about the financial houses that issue billions of dollars of bonds to fund water transport schemes, or the construction companies which profit as a result of bonding of the public, who really, and begs the question, who really wants to back earth-generated water as an energy and natural resources alternative in Iran? Before we entertain questions, allow me to just share with you, let me get out of share screen now. Very good. And I will share with you a clip. There we are. This is short. I hope everybody can hear it. If not, please speak up.
Humans have struggled to survive, but those living in these conditions, they have fought to live. The arid and semi-arid conditions make life for every living organism difficult. For humans, it's the hardest. And practically nothing lives here in this hostile environment. This is a desert in Iran. And if you want to survive here, there's only one way. The key to survival lies in the hands of these people. These are the people that transform this desert into bustling cities. People that usually lose their sight for working underground, and people that live in the darkness all their lives. Calm and steady as they go in tens of meters underground, braving their lives every day to bring livelihood for others. These are the people that bring water to the cities. These are the people that dig qanats, the veins of the desert. As I went to the city of Yazd, seeing the hustle and bustle of the city, I wanted to know more about what made these cities exist. The first place I visited was the Water Museum in Yazd. And the first thing that amazed me,
It's amazing how deep down they went.
these people practically lived underground. With the number of rooms in this house under the ground level, one can realize that life existed more below the surface than above. And the water from the qanats would come in the basements and go from one home to the other.
We're at about 30 meters underground, and still people used to work in these waterways to get water.
The underground system was dug by hand over decades with the simplest of tools. The technology was developed by Persians about 3,000 years ago, and the technique spread along the Silk Road eastwards towards China and also westwards to as far away as Spain. Qanats are hand-dug tunnels that begin in the foothills of the mountains and wind gradually downhill to bring water to the homes kilometers away. A horizontal tunnel with a gentle slope that partly cuts through the aquifer. The slope was quite sensitive, as if it was too steep, it would wash away the tunnel, and if it was not steep enough, the water wouldn't flow. So it was quite an art to make these qanats. Everything here was based on this technique, and the water had many uses.
To cope with the summer heat, people in Yazd used to have water in their basements to keep it cool during the summer days.
Sometimes, together with wind towers, a continuous breeze was available in the summers. The water power was also harnessed to drive underground mills.
In the desert, there's no surface water, so they would use the water from these underwater canals to turn the mills.
Because of Iran's extensive history on qanats, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, has founded a center on its research in Iran. Head of the center, Mr. Semsar Yazdi, told me how many active qanats there still are.
در حال حاضر 37000 رشته قنات فعال وجود داره و این 37000 رشته قنات 7 میلیارد متر مکعب سالیانه آب به بخش کشاورزی کشور تحویل میدن.
And how much energy was being saved by them.
یه محاسباتی هم ما یه وقت انجام دادیم که اگر این 7 میلیارد متر مکعب را در واقع می‌خواستیم از طریق پمپ، یعنی با استفاده از سوخت فسیلی یا انرژی الکتریکی می‌خواستیم استحصال بکنیم، به 800 مگاوات برق احتیاج بود. به عبارت دیگه یعنی به یه نیروگاه بسیار بزرگی احتیاج بود.
So not only was this water bringing life and crops, but it was also saving the environment by making one less power plant. But making these canals isn't the simplest. Those that worked here, the Moghannis, were ready to die every day. For me, walking in this qanat for several meters was the most I could do just to get a feel of what these men went through.
This is a qanat that they have dug 28 kilometers from here to reach the spring of a mountain.
Just walking in this condition for several meters was difficult for me, but these men worked here and dug for years in this posture, and their journey wasn't meters, but kilometers. Mr. Labaf Khaneki also told me about the oldest qanat in Iran that is located in northeastern Iran, dating back to 2,700 years ago, and he said it still has water in it.
The deepest canal is located in the province of Khorasan. The deepest canal is the canal of Qasab Gunabad. This canal, the deepest point of this canal is about 300 meters deep.
Every kilometer took about a year to complete, but the longest took centuries.
طولانی‌ترین قنات ایران قنات زارچ هست با طول 80 کیلومتر و قدمت اون هم حدوداً 1500 سال پیش برمیگرده.
Looking at all the hard work done, it seems it's all worth the while. Now with the help of these ancient water conveyance systems, many cities today are green because of the canals handed down by their ancestors. People that dug these knowing their grandchildren would use this water and not themselves.
These long stretching trees and this water are the result of decades of work underground by hardworking men. This is not normal water. Pedram Khoedadi for Iran.
I thank you all for your kind attention, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions you might have. I hope I can answer them. Much obliged.
Dr. Morad Eghbal, thank you very much for your presentation. You took us through the history of United States and Europe and world, actually, that how the sources of water was recognized by different scientists, geologists, and then you took us all the way to Iran, and you gave a program actually to Iran that, you know, how they can get access to different resources that exist in the things. I really appreciate that. It was a very scientific presentation with point to the finding a solution for the Iran situation. Thank you very much. And let's, those people that have questions, please raise their hand and I allow them to ask question. You can ask, Dr. Eghbal told me that you can ask question in English or in Farsi. And we try, you know, he tried to answer it best he could. Okay, let's see. I first, Goli Kashani raised hand. Okay, let me unmute you, Goli. Okay, go ahead, unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes. I wanted to thank Dr. Eghbal very, very much for this fascinating educational lecture on our Earth's water supplies. I have a question I wanted to ask you. The accidental discovery that you mentioned in Nevada, is that the same concept as the film that we just saw with the Ghanats? Because Nevada is a desert state, and the gentleman that was showing us the film was also saying that these Ghanats go deep inside where there's no life, no trees, nothing, and they dig so far in, and then there's these waters that supply the cities close by. So is that the same concept or is this different?
Thank you very much for your question, and it is very incisive and very poignant. The answer to it is we don't know for sure, except what I've studied in the practices of the Moghanis in Iran. I have come to the conclusion that I do not know how it came about, but the tradition was passed from father to son to grandson to great-grandson, all the knowledge. Not in a way, not unlike the way I was taught by Stefan Ries, because he taught me what I know about the subject matter. And so they had to have known something about the non-hydrologic cycle of water. And I purposefully, thanks to my support of my family, I was able to find this Anat clip short, because there are many, many, many other materials available. But I wanted to have a short one to cause exactly the question with which you opened, because in Iran, we don't have enough rain to allow for this kind of water. And you can't just go and start digging someplace. They had to have known where to begin, how to begin, and how to systematically proceed. So Qanat system is indigenous to Iran. No other country, no other civilization, not from the Chinese, no one has developed that. It went from there to Oman, it went to places in Iraq, it went to in Central Asia, but it is an Iranian Persian practice. And for whatever time is left for me on this earthly plane, if I had the opportunity, I would love to go back to the country of my birth and do further studies and really understand how it is that these people were so competent to develop these systems that we have at the present time. You heard it said, 37,000 qanats are still functioning in Iran. That's a huge number. So I hope to have answered your question.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Dr. Eghbal. And the next one is Delawar. I unmute you. Go ahead, Delawar.
Thank you, Dr. Eghbal, for your informative presentation. I have been following climate, not necessarily water, but I also have been following climate and global justice. I actually broadcast a site that anyone who wants to know about any updates on IPP Northwest Canada. I'm living in Canada and I'm following up on these things in Canada. Please follow up that link that I have sent to the chat. I wanted to mention that because there was a very good book on global issues and world security, and the authors were presenting it on over 2 months on Saturday mornings. And I truly enjoyed it, Dr. Eghbal. I do not know if you know about it or not, but in that presentation, the authors mentioned that the militaries in the world are exempt from reporting the amount of CO2 that they produce in the world, because we are going to be having limiting to 1.5, the maximum 1.5 for all the world, but militaries in the world are exempt from reporting that. So in a way, militarization, and again, they mentioned that pretty soon they're going to be using the, I think the North Pole or South Pole for militaristic purposes also. So we are going to be facing very, very huge dangers in our global. Now, my question from you, Dr. Eghbal, is this. You mentioned that there are 195 countries in the world, independent countries. And let's say these are 195 boats. And can we assume that instead of all of these boats running their boats, we can put them in a jacuzzi, not in a jacuzzi, in a ship that, we have cruise lines. So we have 195 cabins, and there is a captain that runs in terms of global running and global government that have been dedicated by, they have representatives from all over the world. Instead of all of these countries try to lead their own country and secure fresh water, like British Columbia, Canada, and it has a lot of water, but there are many parts of the world that they do not have water. Who is going to determine who gets what sources, and designation of these things to all the people of the world, unless and until we have, according to the authors of that book, Dr. Eghbal, that all of these 195 boats are installed in a cruise ship, in a big ship being run by the entire world government. Thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Eghbal.
Thank you, Mr. Ghachanos. Thank you for your question also. Allow me to answer your question in two different ways. One of them is, of course, I like the imagery that you used of boats and ships and water, because ships require water. They don't, on dry land, they're useless. So, of course, the analogy is useful as long as the ship doesn't leak, figuratively speaking. So the question I would pose back to the entire audience here is, well, under what circumstances might this ship leak? And you started your question with these little exemptions that we have. Military doesn't have to account for this. Military is exempt from that. So how can we get around to instead doing a different approach? And I have put in the chat column, and we'll get to all the points in the chat column. I'm leaving as much time as you want to discuss all of it, because I don't want anybody going away unhappy that their point was not considered or not discussed. But if you want some of my publications, I'll be very happy to send you by email and the answer to your question brings us back, in my mind's eye, to the cylinder of Cyrus. You're familiar with it, of course. It's part of our culture. And what does Cyrus say? What does Cyrus say? He says, in my realm, imagine how liberal-minded a king had to be in those days, more than 2,000 years ago. He said, in my realm, no government official shall impose any religion on anybody else. In my realm, men and women are equal. In my realm, he basically internationalized that which the Code of Hammurabi had already a couple of hundred years before that laid the groundwork for. So if we can get back to that consciousness, then we stand a chance to save ourselves from ourselves. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. We're just rearranging, to go back to your statement about the ship, we're rearranging furniture on the ship Titanic. So yes, I agree with you that it requires consensus, but even I don't want to politicize the question, even though in my presentation I said water and politics are almost impossible to separate. But we have to look at water in the context of its importance for all of our civilizations, not just Persian civilization, across the entire globe. So yes, I think it is really important. And if any of you have resources at your disposal, books that you know that I think I should read, I'm still at the beginning of my journey and I'm learning. So I'll be very happy. You'll be all my teachers to point me to these resources so I may edify myself further and be a little bit more intelligent next time I have to present something. Thank you kindly.
Thank you, Dr. Eghbal. And Dr.
There are
Eghbal,
some points in the chat. I'll leave it up to you, Dr. Morimi. Go ahead.
Right. He put his email over there. So if you have further question, or if you are want some of his publication about that, you can communicate with Dr. Eghbal. I don't see anybody raise hand. So you can, if you have a question, you can ask in Farsi or in English, doesn't matter, and we try to answer it. And since nobody is raised hand, I have a few questions, Dr. Eghbal. Okay, you mentioned that there is, if I pronounce it incorrectly, excuse me, vadose and magnetic water. What is the difference between these two types of water? And you mentioned the Harlem hospital story about so many waters. And so where was the source of this water that they discovered during this time that they were doing that? And you mentioned earth-generated water, that you said you proposed that they put the name of earth-generated water. So what is the source of this earth-generated water?
All right.
And my last question is that you had a plan for Iran at the end of your presentation. So if you go a little bit in details in this plan, or is it possible for you to explain this plan in Farsi for our audience? I appreciate that.
All right, I'll try to get to all of your different questions, Dr. Morimi, systematically. So the difference between, and one of my slides alluded to it, vadose comes from the Latin word vadosus, which means shallow. So vadose waters are shallow waters, and magmatic waters, not magnetic, magmatic, as the word implies, are waters that come from the magma. So just put a peg in that for a minute. I'll come back to it in 1 second. Meteoric water is all the other water that is circulating through the hydrologic cycle, because the idea was that it was caused by meteors. Now, you had asked a question about what the difference is and how earth-generated water comes about. please all indulge me for a really millisecond of a quick excursion through geophysics and geology. And I hope I don't lose anybody in the audience. The center of the Earth, you have to ask ourselves, why is the center of the Earth so hot that we get eruptions and they're very destructive? The center of the Earth is basically a hydrogen furnace. The Earth is constantly burning hydrogen. So when I use the word burning, the question is, how can hydrogen burn? Well, it needs oxygen. It needs oxygen. And where does the oxygen come from? It gets pulled down. Oxygen in the mineral world is ubiquitous. It isn't flying around as a gas, but it is tied up with all kinds of other minerals. The most ubiquitous, the most frequent use of oxygen comes from silicon dioxide. What is silicon dioxide? It's quartz. You go to the beach and you can see the enormous amounts of quartz that you find on the beach. And that's just a minuscule fraction of the total amount of quartz available. That quartz gets pulled down toward the center of the Earth because of thermodynamic cells that circulates heat. And as it gets deeper, it melts, it releases oxygen. Hydrogen makes a grab for oxygen. And I don't want to lose everybody else over all the science of it, but the science of it is pretty well documented. So the moment water is combined, hydrogen and oxygen combine to form water, now you have all of a sudden water in the interior of the Earth. I was going to do my PhD dissertation at Johns Hopkins way back when, before this minor event of the 1979 revolution in Iran drew a red line across it, was approved and everything else. But the point of it is my research continued. And that process still continues. That's why I chose, rather than saying, if you say the word primary water, and there is a website on the Primary Water Institute, the author who built it recently passed away. I had a long-standing discussion with him. I said, if you use that word, the very first thing everybody will ask, logically, if this is primary, what is secondary? And it is not a question of what is primary or secondary. There are two concurrent systems that are running. And of the two, Earth-generated water will produce more water than hydrologic cycle water will ever produce. Last point, if there is so much water being produced, you have to ask yourself, well, why are we not all floating like the film, Kevin Costner's film, The Waterworld? Why are we not floating on an entire ocean of water? The answer is that at the same time, significant amounts of water are being quote unquote destroyed. How? By plants, by trees, by shrubs, by every greenery. How? Because of a process called goodness, my memory lapses. Not osmosis. Chlorophyll will take carbon dioxide, combine it with water to turn it into sugars. And as a result, water is constantly being drawn away. It's constantly being consumed by plants and by animals, but predominantly by plants. So that's the cycle. Now, the third item you said with regard to my plan for Iran, I can go through the 5 points in summary in Persian, but I'll be happy if anybody didn't quite get it. First of all, what I said, I'll be happy to share. I'll provide it to Dr. Morimi, and he's welcome to circulate it to whomever he wishes. And all of you are, to pass it on. But in summary, I was saying that you have to have a complete inventory of all the sort, I should say it in Persian. لازم است که از هر جا و هر محلی که در مملکت ایران، مملکتمون آب پیدا میشه، ما باید یه لیست فراهم بکنیم. چه مقدار آب هست، چه جور آب هست، از کجا میاد، فصل به فصل عوض میشه یا خیر. و سه تا طبقه بندی است. یکیش برای استفاده مردم که نظافت روزانه‌شون و غیره، یه طبقهش برای استفاده شرکت هاست و در فعالیت های تولیدی مثل ذوب‌آهن و غیره که آب لازم دارن برای کارهای تجارتی است. و سومی برای تمام دولت هاست که برای استفاده شرایط اختصاصی استفاده بشه آب. و این طبقه دوم، راه دوم برنامه من این هستش که ما بعد از اینکه این کار رو کردیم مشخص بکنیم که در کدوم جاها چه نوع چاهی میتونه کنده بشه، به خصوص با توجه به همین برنامه قناتی که شما 3-4 دقیقه آخر برنامه من رو دیدین شما. چهارمین نکتهش اینه که باید تمام اینا رو ما بسته‌بندی بکنیم با یه برنامه کامپیوتری که از مشهد گرفته تا آبادان، از تبریز گرفته تا زاهدان، تمام مملکت روز به روز ما دقیقاً بدونیم که چقدر آب مصرف میشه و چقدر آب نیاز دارن، چون که سال به سال، فصل به فصل عوض بدل میشه و از راههای لوله کشی میتونیم به راحتی از اون جاهایی که بیشتر آب دارن به بقیه مملکتمون برسونیم که همه به اندازه کافی برای زندگیشون آب داشته باشن. و پنجمین نکته ای رو که من ارائه کردم این بودش که از تمام قوانین مملکتمون نسبت به محیط زیست و آب باید کاملا یه اینونتوری بشه، یه رونوشتی باید بشه که ما اینو باید بیاریم توی شرایط بین المللی حقوقی که وفق بدیم، یه کار حقوقی تطبیقی است، وفق بدیم با تمام بقیه قوانین که الان وقتش هم نیست که من بتونم توضیح بدم ولی جزو کارم هستش و اینو میشه آدم پیاده بکنه. این پیشنهاد من بود آخر برنامه. امیدوارم جواب سوالاتتون رو داده باشم.
خیلی متشکرم، مرسی. حسین جان انمیوت کن خودتو.
بله متشکرم. Thanks a lot دکتر مقیمی، کانون دوستداران and Professor Eghbal for this wonderful representation. I don't have any question, but I saw something in my life. I want to share it with you. A couple of years ago, more than a couple of years ago, actually, I don't know, 10 years ago or 8 years ago, some relative, they took me to قنات قصبه in Gunabad, Khorasan. That Professor Eghbal, he mentioned about that. If there is enough time, I want to explain what I saw over there. I traveled a lot around the world, but unfortunately, I didn't see my own country. And it was very interesting for me. And after that, after seeing Qanat Qasabe Gunabad, and there was another thing, another meal in a khaf, which they grounded the wheat with the wind. Right. Which I have a picture. Let me show you. I got a picture over there. If you can see that with the wind. Yeah, I have another one. Fortunately, they were here. After that, I was very interested that what a wonderful country I have. And I didn't see my country. And after that, I was going to Iran every year or sometimes twice a year before Corona. Let me see, there's not enough time. Let me tell you what I saw over there. It was very interesting for me when I went to inside the Qanat. At the beginning, unfortunately, they took me somewhere the beach. I didn't see anything. I saw some holes in the ground that there were some bottles, some cigarette ends and these things. I think drug addicted people, they used to go over there and find somewhere to hide their use their drugs or whatever. But later on, I found a Land Rover somewhere. I told them, let me go over there to see what's going on. And it means I hit the target. I saw a couple of professors, they came from University of Isfahan to see the Qanat Qasabe. Unfortunately, they finished their visit, and I told them, hey guys, listen, I came from other side of the globe, from other side of the world. And they say, yeah, it's interesting. He came from other side of the door. Let's open the door again. They opened the door for me, and we went together with those people that they came from Isfahan, and they show me briefly. And it was interesting when I feel that I was in one of the point that it say it was, I think, the deepest point, 300 something like that meter underground, and we went with such a this close and up to my chest, you know. We were walking in the water. Just the only things, everything, wallet was wet, so only our cellular phones was in our hand. We saved the cellular phones. And it was very interesting. Oh, I'm 300 meters underground? Oh my God. Listen, and then he was explaining that this canal built in 27th century ago. Am I right, Dr.
Yes.
Eghbal? Yeah, century. And after
2,700 years ago.
Yeah, 2,700 years ago, 27th century ago. Then beside those things that Kurosh established in that country about the humans' right, all of the people are same and these things. And I saw, I told myself, beside that, I have something else to be proud. In that time, we had such this technology. I am 300 meters underground, and it was something for me. And the other interesting things that I saw over there, I saw some roots. They came to, you know what I mean? Actually,
Yes.
Do you know what are those roots in desert, which is dry? In Farsi, it's called khar, thorn. Thorn, the reddish, I think they don't have flowers, anything. Some thorn, khar, in a desert. They go down whatever to find the water. It was the other interesting things. And let me tell you, in some points, it was it was a big hole that even somebody can go inside with the horse, sitting in the back of the horse, and with the horse go through that canal. And eventually they told me on that point is going to go, we are going to go to the point that is going to be two branches.
Right.
One of them is hot water.
The other one is cold.
That's it. It was cold. But I embarrassed to take them more over there. I said, that's enough. You did a big favor and highly appreciated. We came back. And it was interesting. And after that, and seeing those pictures that I show you, those mills, which they work, that one is not, I believe, is not that old. After that, I was interested to go to Iran, and I went. Every year I had a trip to Iran. I really enjoyed, and some people do. I saw a lot of things that I have to. There is no time to tell you that in that country, especially in some parts like Hamadan, they said if you take a shovel or something like that, you put everywhere, you will see something is coming out. And that's Iran. And they told me Iran is very very big Ganjina. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a treasure trove. It's a treasure trove, to be sure. And I don't want to interrupt your train of thought, Hossein Khan, but I'll be very happy to converse with you and to communicate with you offline. And what you said is true. I mean, there's a parallel to it in New York City too, because in 1993, I was involved in a project to develop water in Manhattan. And as a part of the project, I had occasion to get underground with the third water tunnel for New York. I've walked the entire length of it, and it is exactly as you described it, because the tunnel is big enough for an entire railroad to go through it. And I was given permission to take samples of water coming forth as I've described it in my presentation. So these kinds of situations are not at all surprising or unfamiliar to me, and part and parcel of my own scholarship and work. So I appreciate your contributions to the discussion. And if all of you don't mind, I'd like to not ignore the questions that are in the chat. So maybe as everybody else thinks about further questions, let me just go one by one quickly through them and try to answer them, and we come back to it again.
Yeah, highly appreciated. Thank you.
Dan Danforth says, can you make a brief comment about the attraction and value of mineral springs and hot springs as healing waters? Oh, wow. I will have to humbly ask Dr. Morimi to schedule another session, and I'll be happy to come back and talk about it. But keep in mind that mineral springs tend to be hot springs. You don't find, except for parts of Europe, where, for example, along the Danube River, you have some mineral baths and mineral springs that have cold mineralized water. Those are quite rare in the entire realm. And if Mr. Danforth doesn't mind, I'd like to beg off a more complete explanation, because I have to go into a lot of detail of science of why some are cold and some are hot. But yes, healing waters can be both hot and cold. But as in the case of California, for example, any of you know Murrieta Hot Springs, that's very, very hot water. Or in Idaho, there are some places with very hot water, and that's water that rises very quickly past a magmatic wall that transfers the heat. So if you don't mind, if that's okay, I'll go to the next one. Mr. Hassan Shahpari, there was a plan under the Shah that in case of drastic drought, a transfer of population can be done towards the south of Iran. Was it a practical plan? Could transfer of population would be a possible solution when there is a long-term? Yes, that is exactly one of the legs of my 5-part national water plan for Iran. And my interest in that subject matter arose before I met even Stefan Ries in 1973. I reached out to some other members of my family to get some statistics from Iran, and very gently I got pushed back. They said, you know, listen, Morad, the matter of water is so sensitive in Iran, it is even more sensitive than oil. So there is not much. You're probably better off going to the United Nations and finding whatever they might have about Iranian water resources. So I didn't get discouraged. I just had to refashion my questions and keep searching for it. The US President Biden recently stated that fracking or for natural gas will not be going away. Yes, regrettably, he said that. What is your evaluation of fracking for natural gas? A great idea if you want to destroy the planet. Fracking is a because we are pressurizing fractures, and those fractures will move water, and you've seen instances in Ohio, in Kansas, because of fracking, you've had increased mini earthquakes, and in some other parts of a city, the water comes out of the faucet brown instead of being potable. So it's not a good idea. Really, it isn't. And it's being oversold. Yes, to answer your question, yes, you're welcome to share the recording as far and as wide as possible. And I am happy to share with you my earlier publication. There was this article I alluded to in the year 2000 in Infinite Energy magazine. It was the lead article on Earth-generated water. I have published before that in 1991 an article on ozone depletion, and you may ask yourself, oh, you know, what does ozone depletion have to do with water? Well, the article explains there's a definitive water cycle in the size of the ozone hole and how ozone is absorbed by our planet. There's a distinct water component in that too. So I'd be happy to share that. And for anybody else who's interested, I recently, a few years back, 5 years back, co-authored with a friend and colleague of mine an article on the larger parameter of societal functioning, meaning, we suggested a model, a current Kurosh-like model of how we might end up all on the same ship that Mr. Ad-Shenas suggested we should be thinking about. And I always welcome your thoughts on whatever I'm doing, because it's an evolving process. On that point, you know, my brain just caught up with myself, because what I was looking for earlier was photosynthesis. Photosynthesis destroys water, quote unquote. Nothing ever gets destroyed in this world we're living in. It just transforms. But photosynthesis takes water and sunlight and chlorophyll and converts it into C6H12O6, which is sugar. All right, I think Mr. Danforth had his hand up, so I think I've got, there's a suggestion by Dr. Hosseini that we should also maybe invite someone from Paris to talk about ecological and environmental issues in Iran, which are atrocious. Don't even get me started. I'll keep you there until tomorrow morning for breakfast, and I have difficulty serving breakfast over Zoom, so bear with me. But yes, I agree. You should have someone from maybe Paris talk about the environmental issues. Mr. Danforth, you had your hand up. I think if I saw that correctly, I'd be happy to entertain your question if you have one.
Yeah, I saw Jan's hand was up, but now it's down. But Jan, do you want to? You can unmute yourself if you have.
I'm sorry, it's Jan Danforth. My apologies.
That's okay. This is just brilliant. My head is spinning. I would like to share the recording with Blue Water Baltimore. Do you know that organization?
I've heard of them, but I don't really know them, you know, to a degree of sufficiency. Maybe I should, and I'd be happy if you wish. I put my email.
Yes, I'll send that to you. I had another question further in the chat. Have you ever seen the documentary Gasland?
No, I have not.
It was made maybe 10 years ago, and it was when fracking first started in the United States. And I recommend that. And very quickly, another question in the chat that I put. Why is Greta Thunberg repudiated by certain world leaders? She seems to be right on the front lines.
Well,
of
I'll try to answer that. Of course, your question implies, in a way, if you don't mind my saying so, that such world leaders have a legitimate claim to be called world leaders.
This is, yes, I understand.
No,
I don't intend that as my meaning. That's why I put leaders in quotes.
I know, I understand completely. So the challenge for Greta Thunberg is twofold for the entire current generation, and they just don't know how to quote unquote deal with her. The first challenge is that as a young child, literally as a young child, she figured out a very effective way of civil protest. Much, much better than all of the truckers who want to occupy the roads. She organized kids, and who's gonna go and fight with kids? Who's gonna put themselves to shame to fight with kids? So she organized them to get her point across. That's point number one. And point number two is that in her quest to get answers from adults, and she's now an adult herself, a young adult herself, she is really relentless. She's smart, she's well-informed, she's well-supported, and she's relentless. And the questions she poses and what she points out has really, if you look at it very closely, has really not much to do with ecology and environment. It goes straight to the heart of the power structure that our country and our world has constructed, and it is falling apart bit by bit. And no power ever yields easily. So they try to ignore her, and she won't be ignored. And I think therein lies her wonderful redeeming quality. I've reached out to Greta Thunberg, but the unfortunate part of it is that both in her case as well as a few others, you know, they are all well encapsulated into their entourage, and you don't always get an answer. And I don't have patience to sit and keep, you know, being the forgive the analogy, the thorn in the side of somebody until they pay attention to me. I have enough challenges just to keep my brain current.
As far as I'm concerned, you're on the front lines as well.
Very kind of you to say that.
And the other thing I feel about Greta is I'm grateful that she finally said out loud, because 2030 is too far off and 2050 is terribly far off, and we should be making a difference now, and the leaders, so-called leaders, are not doing it. And I appreciated it when Greta just spoke to everyone and said, so it's just blah, blah, blah.
Mhm.
That really, really very few people took that. They knew this is what we see. They're just speaking words. They're not doing what needs to be done. And
Right.
I appreciate it. I'm off the platform. Let another person take a turn.
Thank you. The aforementioned article my friend and colleague and I published was in 2015-16 in regard to Brexit. And in it, we basically dared the British government to be courageous and gutsy to, just the same way as England gave us the common law system. And here again, I don't want to take up everybody's time, digress with a mini lecture, but the difference between civil law systems and common law systems is that the common law system confers upon the individual the ultimate right and power. Civil law system always, it does it too, but in a different way. It always presumes that you have to have parliament to pass a law, which then reflects the common consensus. And therein lies the brilliance of the Edict of Cyrus, because that's the document that truly combined civil law and common law systems long before they became two distinct systems. But don't get me started, because my comparative law classes used to start with an analysis of the Code of Hammurabi and the Edict of Cyrus, and I don't want to get everybody completely worn out and say, well, you know, we're all exhausted from tonight.
Well, Dr. Eghbal, thank you very much. I don't see anybody's hand up, so probably we have to invite you another time to talk about comparative laws. That's another of your expertise that we would like to learn from you. So
I'm very grateful for this opportunity that Kanoon has given me, and I hope it has been of benefit to all. And as I said, I'm open to suggestions and to any further dialogue. Please email me. I'll be happy to be in touch with you.
Yeah, email him and get his publications, and you know, if you have any experience to share, like Hossein share his experience, that'd be interesting also to share. Okay, I don't see anybody's hand, so Dr. Eghbal, thank you very much from on behalf of the Kanoon members and board of directors. I appreciate your presentation, and we would like to come back. We have allowed every 6 months a speaker come and talks to us in different subjects. So we'll be in touch, and if you allow us to share these video links with the people that they want, or if you want to share your presentation, you can send it to me, and we can share that presentation also online if you want.
I'll be happy